Hello and welcome everyone to the Women's Major Group parallel event at the Commission on the Status of Women's 65th meeting. We are delighted that all of you are with us. We have an incredible panel of speakers we're so lucky to have among us. Before we begin, we'd like to make some logical announcements, but even before that, my apologies. Let me thank all of our members who have contributed to this little video we've made, the Don't Rush Challenge video that we have made during HLPF 2020 to highlight the feminist demands of our members throughout the world. They've sent in their videos actually, and this was compiled from all their demands. So thanks to all of them. And without further ado, let me make the logistical announcements we have. We will have translation to Spanish and English. If you can kindly go to the globe under your Zoom. If you select the language you want to listen the meeting in, even if it's English, that will be very helpful. We'll have speakers speaking in Spanish, for example. So please do choose your channel. Our accessibility coordinator today is our dear Andrea Vega Troncoso. So you can write to her in chat whenever you face an accessibility problem. Further, I'd like to remind all of you that our meeting is, of course, bound by the NGO CSW virtual safety guidelines for this platform, which we will be sharing in a second in the chat. So without further ado, I'd like to give the floor to our moderator for our parallel event today and our organizing partner for the Arab states, Shaima Ali, head of Kenana Association for Women Empowerment in Egypt and president of Net Impact for Women's Economic Empowerment Gulf Cooperation Council Countries Chapter. Thank you very much for joining again. Shaima, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Shinnaz. Welcome everyone and welcome our panelists. The Women Major Group, as you know, I will start with just a short introduction. The Women Major Group is a global intersectional feminist collective with members throughout the whole world. And our primary mandate, as you all know, is to facilitate and support our members in their feminist advocacy in the United Nations Sustainable Development process, especially at the regional and global levels. We are happy to be joined by many of our members in this event, and I would like to thank you for your time and dedication. As you know, we have organizing partners from all regions of the world, including Anglophone Africa region, Latin America and Caribbean, Arab states, Asia, Europe and Central Asia, and North America, as well as global organizing partners. Even before the onset of the crisis caused by the COVID-19, as the world faced mutually reinforcing crises of inequality, environmental degradation, rising insecurity, protracted armed conflicts, especially in our regions, in Arab states, growing fundamentalism and corporate power, which is happening alongside outright attacks on multilateralism and especially the participatory democracy, and of course the shortening or the limiting space for civil society and the environmental and women human rights defenders. As the COVID-19 pandemic, in fact, has made the systematic gaps and the defaults, as well as the crisis we are facing, more visible. However, it didn't create them. The need for transformative systems change towards a more just and equal world has never been more clear than now. And the Sustainable Development Goals, if implemented from a human rights-based approach, a transformative approach, can support actually ourselves towards building a better and more just and equitable future for all of us. Among this, gender equality stands at a crucial point, like a key to unlocking the achievement of all other sustainable development goals. In this regard, as a Women Major Group, we are continuing our fierce feminist advocacy efforts for making the decade of action a success to deliver on the sustainable development goals. Feminist and women's and girls' human rights advocates have continuously questioned business as usual and have pushed for more just and equitable visions of the world. Drawing on our tools of analysis, policymakers will be able to envision new and alternative ways of governance that respond to the needs and the rights of this most left behind. Given the central role that feminists and women in general, and girls also, adults and girls movements play in driving systematic change, governments and other actors should take these recommendations seriously in order to accelerate actions for the achievement of 2030 agenda and uphold their human rights obligations. I will be slowing down a little bit because of our translators. I just take a note of this. So just quickly about the Women Major Group, as I stated before, the Women Major Group is a global intersectional feminist collective with members from all over the world. And our primary mandate is to facilitate and support our members in their feminist advocacy in the United Nations Sustainable Development processes. Okay, I will continue now. This year, the Commission of the Status of Women, with its priority theme of women's full and effective participation and decision-making in public life, as well as the elimination of violence, which actually escalated through the COVID-19 crisis, for achieving gender equality and the empowerment of all women and girls, and its review theme of women's empowerment and the link to the sustainable development presents us a very important point in time that we can discuss the intersections of all these issues. In order to aid this discussion, today we are very lucky to be joined by an esteemed panel of speakers, which I really appreciate, and I'm very glad to have them today. Firstly, I have His Excellency Ambassador Jukka Salovara, and I wish I pronounced the name correctly, a permanent representative of Finland to the United Nations. Ambassador Jukka Salovara is serving as the permanent representative of Finland to the United Nations since 2019. Upon his appointment, Mr. Salovara was the Director General for Political Affairs in his country's Ministry for Foreign Affairs since 2015. Among his other previous posts, he was the Director General for Europe at the Foreign Ministry from 2011 to 2015. State Undersecretary for European Union Affairs in the Office of the Prime Minister from 2008 to 2011. Counsel to the Foreign Affairs Committee of Finland's Permanent Commission from 2007 to 2008. And Foreign Policy Advisor to the Prime Minister from 2006 to 2007. Earlier in his career, Mr. Salovara was the Counsel to Parliament's Foreign Affairs Committee from 2005 to 2006, and Foreign Policy Advisor to the Prime Minister from 2003 to 2004, and the Senior Officer in the Government Secretariat for European Union Affairs in the Office of the Prime Minister from 2001 to 2003. Having earned a Master of Political Science degree from the University of Helsinki in 1992, Mr. Salovara became a research fellow at the Finnish Institute of International Affairs from 1992 to 1994. So I'm very glad to have him today. Our second panelist is His Excellency Ambassador Agustin Santos Maraver. He is a permanent representative of Spain to the United Nations. Ambassador Agustin Santos Maraver have been serving as a permanent representative of Spain to the United Nations since 2018. A career diplomat, Mr. Santos Maraver first joined the Foreign Service in 1982. as first secretary at Spain's embassy in Beijing. Since then, he has been posted to the embassies in Havana, Washington, D.C., and Canberra, and in Brussels, where he was accredited to the European Union. In addition, he served as advisor to the diplomatic cabinet of the president of the government or prime minister from 1992 to 1995, and as chef du cabinet to the president of the Spanish Agency for International Cooperation and Development from 1991 to 1992. Mr. Santos Maravar holds a Bachelor of Arts in Philosophy and Literature, as well as in Political Science and Sociology from Complutense University in Madrid, where he also earned a doctoral degree in philosophy and in political science. He also has a diploma in international studies from Diplomatic School in Madrid. Our third panelist, who I'm very glad to have here today, is Dr. Joliet Biao Kaudunkope. I wish I pronounced her name correctly. She is a United Nations. She is working as a United Nations Environment Program. She's a regional at the Regional Office for Africa Director and Regional Representative. Dr. Juliet Biao, the UN Environment Program Director and Regional Representative for Africa, has a wealth of experience in international development and over 30 years managing development initiatives in Latin America, Canada, and Africa, with a focus on the environment, community, livelihood, and gender equality. Dr. Joliet has worked with a range of international organizations, developing, managing, and mobilizing resources. And she also pioneered the groundbreaking initiatives, including participatory management of protected areas. She has previously served as the Minister of Environment and Nature Protection in Benin, as well as acting Minister of Family and the Child. Dr. Biao holds a doctoral degree in public policy and administration and master degree in forestry economics, as well as other numerous academic and professional certificates. She received the Global Women Leadership and Green Future Leadership Award for her leadership and achievements in the field of environmental management and sustainable development. Dr. Biao has been awarded the highest title of Commander of the National Order of Merit in Benin. Our fourth panelist is Diego Guener, Enlace Continental de Mujeres Indígenas de los Americas, Continental Liaison of Indigenous Women of the Americas. I wish I am pronouncing your name also correctly. Gelga is an indigenous activist of the OPG Organization of Western Guarani Peoples in Paraguay. She is also a member of the Youth Commission of Enlace Continental de Mujeres Indígenas de las Americas, or the Continental Link of Indigenous Women of the Americas. She defines herself as a social work technician who recently finished a degree in social psychology and cooperation in the elaboration of the international projects for the European Union at the University of Quilmes, Argentina. In 2019, she acceded the internship at the United Nations of the Fellowship Program of the United Nations High Commissioner for Indigenous Representatives. She is currently working in the Western region of her country in cases of human rights violations in indigenous children and adolescents. In addition, she is a mediator in territorial conflicts and the independent consultant at the national level. Our last panelist is Elena Marma, our one before last. She is working at the Global Policy Watch. Elena is an engagement advocacy and policy professional serving as a program officer for the Global Policy Watch, a joint initiative of Social Watch and the Global Policy Forum in New York City, with academic and professional experience in structural and systematic forms of violence. Elena follows United Nations headquarters meetings and conferences, publishing UN monitor and analysis style publications on sustainable development, UN reform and financing for development, while working with civil society organizations based in New York City and Social Watch's extensive network to identify advocacy opportunities. Elena holds a master's degree in violence, conflict, and development from the School of Oriental and African Studies in London, United Kingdom. We have also a panelist, Ms. Sanila Gurung, Beyond the Beijing Committee from Nepal. Sanila has been working to address social and political empowerment of women and girls to achieve gender equality in Nepal. At present, she is a program director at Beyond the Beijing Committee, BBC, Nepal, and contributes to this overall strategic planning, advocacy, and program design and management on women's rights and young people's sexual reproductive health and rights. She has worked with community-based organizations, national level non-governmental organizations, and international agencies. She has extensive advocacy experience at the local, national, and regional level. Thank you so much, our panelists, for joining us today. And I would like to start with one question to all of you. I would like firstly to ask His Excellency Ambassador Yoka Salovara about the reflections on the first 5 years of the implementation and monitoring and review of Agenda 2030. We would like to discuss the effects of our current crisis on the achievements of Agenda 2030. So it's all about your reflections and your review about the current crisis and the impact of the crisis on the implementation of Sustainable Development Goals. So I would like to call His Excellency Ambassador Yoka for his answer, and I thank you in advance. Over to you, Excellency.
Well, thank you so much, Shaiman, and you really did a good job with my name. And I know that, well, Finnish names are never easy. And it's really good to partner with the Women's Major Group at the CSW. And I've had a large number of meetings with you sort of this week already, sort of in the context of the CSW, but also the HLPF, which really sort of well shows that well we are working together, and I'm really glad that I have also my Spanish colleague Agustin on this panel, because well we both belong to an active group of male UN ambassadors that sort of have gender equality as a high priority in our work, and that's always an important point to make, that sort of well gender equality needs to be a mission for men also. And coincidentally, today we are celebrating sort of Equality Day in Finland, and because it's a birthday of an early feminist leader, and so it's a flag day, it's a big national celebration, and by another coincidence, sort of today, Finland was selected again as the happiest country in the world, and I personally believe in a way that sort of these things are interrelated in a way that sort of well having an inclusive society is good for all the people, and that's why sort of we've done well on these counts, and not saying in a way that well we don't have many things where we need to do much better. Gender-based violence is a problem in Finland, and just recently there was a research study about how much sort of well hate speech, for example, sort of female politicians have to endure in their sort of public functions, and this is again a grave matter and a major problem. But back to your question on a reflection of the 5 years of implementation of Agenda 2030. So of course, sort of at this stage, we are witnessing an unprecedented regression on poverty eradication, and this is the first time that well we have seen a rise in poverty in actually decades. And which shows that the implementation of the 2030 agenda was already off track, and now we are at a critical juncture. And the achievement of many of the SDGs is looking unlikely unless decisive action is taken. At the same time, the past year has showed us that governments can take rapid, comprehensive, transformative action if the will and sense of urgency is there. We need to muster a similar sense of urgency in achieving the SDGs, because failing to do so will leave us vulnerable to future crises. The impact of the pandemic and the measures taken to mitigate has been particularly harsh on women and girls. Their rights are under significant threat, particularly sexual and reproductive rights. We have seen significant regression on gender equality in all countries where women have been pushed out of the workforce and into traditional caregiving roles at a scale never seen before. Part of the problem is the fact that women hold the majority of low-skilled or informal jobs, working in sectors that practically evaporated overnight with the COVID-19 pandemic. In sectors such as tourism, women hold the majority of the lower paid jobs that benefit from less employment benefits and job security than the higher management roles paid for by men. One horrific issue we have also had to deal with in Finland is a rise of gender-based and sexual violence that has been observed in countries that have implemented lockdown policies. Trapped in their homes with their abusers, women and girls in abusive situations have been cut off from their support systems and locked into endless cycles of violence and abuse. We therefore need to make sure that our response and recovery efforts are designed in such a way that they urgently address the specific needs of women and girls and lead to the transformation of gender roles in society. In order for this to happen, these efforts cannot be led by men only. Too few women are managing response and recovery efforts. Social and economic policies and programs to confront the fallout of this crisis must be inclusive and transformative, addressing women's leadership and labor both outside and within the home. With women in charge of the efforts, we can ensure that policies are geared to advance gender equality and the implementation of the 2030 Agenda. In this regard, I would like to highlight the following areas of action that are particularly relevant. First, strengthening or establishing universal social protection systems to counter the regression on poverty eradication that has particularly affected women and girls. Second, scaling up sexual and reproductive health services that in many parts of the world have been significantly reduced during the pandemic. Third, scaling up efforts to end all forms of gender-based and sexual violence, including by reviewing legislation to ensure forms of violence such as psychological and verbal abuse are illegal. And fourth, enhance access to childcare services and engage in public awareness campaigns to promote a more equal sharing of responsibilities within the household. These are just some examples of gender transformative policies and practices that should be prioritized in the COVID-19 response and recovery efforts. I look forward to today's discussions to hear many more. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Your Excellency, Ambassador Jukka Salovara. And I would like to pick a few points from what you stated. Firstly, the male power, I believe, is important to reinforce our feminist power. And Equality Day of Finland is today, so I congratulate you for the day. Having inclusive society is good, as you stated, for all population, not only women. You stated some very effective mechanisms in order to mitigate the negative impacts of COVID-19, including universal social protection system, which is quite important to mitigate these impacts. Systems that can mitigate the impacts on girls and adults and girls especially, and mechanisms to address GBV and the domestic violence, of course. and you ended by the necessity to have a mechanism that can enhance the access to child care services at home. So I thank you so much for these interventions, and I believe that they are very important mechanisms. Accordingly, I move to Your Excellency Ambassador Augustine Santos Maravar, asking him the same question about your reflections on the first 5 years of the implementation and monitoring and review of Agenda 2030. And I would like you to give us your insights in terms of the effects of our current crisis on the achievement of Agenda 2030. So over to you, Your Excellency, Ambassador Maravar.
Muchísimas gracias, Shaima. Creo que puedo
Thank you so
hablar.
much, Saima. I think I can speak in Spanish. Thank you so much for the interpretation. I'd like to thank Women's Major Group and the NCSW 65 Forum for this invitation.
Thank you for the invitation.
I think that this
Thank you
is
to
an essential debate.
CSW. I think it's a vital thing to make a balance of where we're coming from and what are the consequences of COVID-19. First of all, I want to start saying that when the Agenda 2030 was signed, the role of women wasn't a peripheral role. They were at the heart of the Agenda 2030. Yes, a substantial increment of women's participation in all the different terrains of social and economical life. Simply, Agenda 2030 was not able to achieve its objectives. Thus, the role of women, it was an essential role to measure where it was, how we were proceeding this agenda. In the case of Spain, this was inclusive, one of our main elements in our exterior policies. We have a guide for exterior policies, and that guide discusses the empowerment of girls and women, a main role, because we believe it's very important thing. Now, COVID-19 has created an unprecedented crisis. When we are saying that it is the largest crisis in 100 years, I don't even think that's enough. The numbers that we have in reference to the economical crisis, and in many, they're gigantic numbers, and women are the ones that occupy the main thing in reference to the health crisis. Women are the ones who have become responsible of the home economy, the economy taking care of elders, and also the things were able to be done at the social and political level. They have gone back to the domestic place. Now women are found again in going backwards inevitably, but we have to respond to this because we cannot go back to that vision of women strictly as home care workers without salaries, without being able to empower themselves, without being able to be autonomous, and without leading in social and political decisions that will determine the future of all of us. When the crisis started, Spain, supported by the UN, introduced to this General Assembly a process of resolution to women and girls. We discuss specifically the defense of girls, and in reference to human rights, and in reference to reproductive sexual rights, and also incrementing their social standing. That resolution was approved as a consensus by the General Assembly, and we believe that it was important, the gesture, in order to prevent the social and economical crisis, how the ambassador of Finland said, retreating qualitatively of the women. We are found in an important place. We cannot go back as far as girls and women's rights. If we do this, we will not be able to achieve Agenda 2030. At the same time, we have to understand what are the essential parts in order to be able to continue in Agenda 2030 from the side of view of empowering of girls and women. First of all, the most important thing is access to political spaces. We need more women in front of the governments, in the government. We need more, we have them have more capacity to participate in the peace processes where they can be hand in hand, no more violence, more solutions at the long place. The second important element is we need to prevent retroducing as far as the role of women and limit them, confine them to reproductive functions, to certain issues where they respond to demographic issues, and at the same time not being integrated to the economy, and where women do not receive a just fair wage for the work that they do of maintaining our society. 30 years ago, we began our projects of cooperation to development, introducing a perspective in gender. We have learned so much from women thanks to this decision. And now I believe that we are in a situation to ask everyone to persist, to continue going forward in women's rights, because if we are not able to extend universal rights stemming from women for everyone, we don't have a way of getting out of this crisis how we want a future of recovery, equal, green, and sustainable. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Maravar, for your intervention. And I would like to just have some takeaways from your statements, including that women participation have been always critical in order to implement the Agenda 2030. COVID-19 created unprecedented crisis, which needs long years to mitigate its impacts. Women are actually frontliners through this crisis. And you stated a very important issue related to the lack of equality in terms of wages, and women who are working even with no wages through this crisis, which have to be, I would say, to have equality in terms of salaries and wages provided to women. You also touched upon the necessity to be committed to girls and women's rights through this critical time, and ensure their equal participation in the peace-making processes and policy-making processes in developed and, of course, regular context countries. So I thank you so much for this intervention, which is very critical to move forward for the implementation of Agenda 2030. Now, I would like to ask the same question and get the insights of Dr. Joliet Biao Kaudunkope in regard to her insights related to the current crisis, and how this current crisis influences the achievement of Agenda 2030 and the implementation of Sustainable Development Goals. And maybe she can provide us also with some mechanisms that we have to consider through this time. Over to you, Dr. Joliet.
Thank you so much, Ms. Moderator. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers of this event for inviting me. It is really a great honor and privilege to be with such a eminent panelists. Congratulations for the video. It's really, really impressive. And congratulations also to His Excellence Ambassador Jukka Salovara for the what do we call the celebration today in Finland, and also to hear that that Finland has been really recognized as the happiest country. I think some years ago it's used to be Costa Rica. Now is Finland. Let me extend also a special thank to Cecile, who connect me with the women's major group. Cecile is a camarade de lutte, as we say in French, for about 2 decades now on this common and noble cause, which is gender equality. Let me also commend the women's major group for the excellent and continuous work of thanks to which we were able to have the SDG 3 on gender equality and empowering all women and girls as a standalone sustainable development goals. And also the hard work they've been doing to continuously push for the effective implementation of SDG 5. That said, let me start by saying that the development can never be sustainable without gender equality. And gender equality also affects every dimension of the sustainable development goals. It cuts across all the 17 sustainable development goals. This is even more true in the context of Africa, where natural resources are the foundation of the economies. And also women, over 80% of women are involved in the food production. The 2020 SDG report is a bit alarming. And I heard also the Excellencies ambassadors also touching upon this. And among other threats that this report reveals is also the increasing inequality. 71 million people are expected to be pushed back into extreme poverty in 2020, the first rise in the global poverty since 1998. Lost incomes, limited social protection, and rise prices means even those who were previously secured could find themselves at risk of poverty and hunger. In Africa, just looking at the sector, energy sector alone, about 6 million people still do not have access to electricity. About 900 million people rely on polluted energy sources for cooking, and these are wood fuel and charcoal. About 600 million people in Africa die each year due to indoor pollution. And 60% of these victims are women and children. The young people aged 15 to 25, representing over 60% of the continent's population, have an employment rate of 60%, and over 70% live with less than $2 a day. This is compounded with the COVID-19 impact, with all associated decline in GDP for the entire continent. Informal employment exceeding 85% of all jobs in Africa. An increased exposure of poor and vulnerable population. But despite this threat, the good news is that the report shows that there are many opportunities to accelerate progress by leveraging the links between the goals. For example, reducing greenhouse gas emission goes hand in hand with creation of jobs, building more livable cities, improving health and prosperity for all. And all this cannot be sustainable without equality and empowerment of all women and girls. Luckily, there is a direct relationship between gender equality, women empowerment, and climate change. On one hand, women are disproportionately vulnerable to the effect of climate change, which could in turn exacerbate existing gender disparities. Climate change has a greater impact on those sections of populations in all countries that are most reliant on natural resources for their livelihood, as it is the case in Africa. Women commonly face higher risk and greater burdens from impact of climate change in situation of poverty. And the majority of the world's poor are women. Women equal participation in decision-making processes and labor markets compound inequalities and often prevent women from fully contributing to climate-related planning, policy making, and implementation. And yet women can play a critical role in the response to climate change due to their local knowledge and leadership in sustainable management and or leading sustainable practices. I can elaborate more and more on that, but I will just stop here, expecting that with other questions, I can have the opportunity to elaborate more on maybe the adverse effect of poor application of gender lens to the climate change solutions and any other question that you might want to ask me. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Dr. Joliet Biao, for your intervention, because you touched upon very important issues. Firstly and foremost, you stated that SDG 5 is a cross-cutting issue in order to implement the Agenda 2030, and the Women Major Group is working hard actually in order to enforce this criteria and enforce this goal to be a cross-cutting issue along the Agenda 2030 implementation process. You also stated that gender equality affects every dimension of the Sustainable Development Goals. You stated very important statistics. For example, the 80% of women are involved in food production in the entire world, and there is a need to increase equality since they are very much engaged in this production level. You stated that 71 million people are pushed to extreme poverty line and potential hunger due to the COVID-19 crisis. Also, I believe that you touched upon the SDG 17 through your discussion, because you stated that creating partnerships is very important to ensure gender equality. You also talked about the equality and empowerment of women and girls being a very important criterion in order to achieve Agenda 2030. But you also stated that climate change cannot be overlooked, and it's a very important aspect to address the current crisis when we are addressing equality and achievement of the Agenda 2030. So I thank you so much for this important intervention, and hereby I move to our next panelist, Ms. Gelga Guiner, from the she's indigenous activist and from Western Guarani people, Paraguay. And I would like to ask you the same question, Ms. Gelga, about your insights in terms of the implementation of Agenda 2030 under the current crisis. How you see that women empowerment and the SDG 5 specifically can be implemented due to the impacts of the current crisis. So over to you, Ms. Gelga.
Hola, muy buenos días a todas, todos y todes.
Hello, everyone. It is a pleasure to be able to participate in this panel, in the discussion and debate panel, and more than anything, about the important contributions of the ODS for women, SDGs. In terms of the question, I think that we have a great responsibility from the indigenous peoples. We have a great responsibility because I consider from the youth, we have a way of looking at things that is a perspective that goes beyond the visibility of responses. And this goes linked with, this is linked to, can I continue, excuse me?
Yes, please, we can hear you.
Okay, bueno,
Okay.
comentaba que tenemos.
So I was saying that we have a vision of what it is that we want for the youth and the children in the future, and what is it that we want to to answer to these issues. In particular, for the SDGs, that they have been implemented in a very disproportionate way, because if the pandemic has created conflict, and there's also a report that makes the context today, it makes it see that there is a crisis that has created great fallbacks, and a lot of the implementation and the objectives have not been completed. So in the pandemic, it hasn't only made the inequality in our society evident, but we can clearly see from the north to the south of our continent, and it also worsens the violences that we live socially, economically, culturally, psychologically, physically, environmentally, and spiritually, for being women, for being indigenous, for having scarce financial resources, and in some cases for being immigrant or for having been displaced. So this is a gap that that requires attention in regards to education, employment, and health, and it has affected us notably. And it has also affected the circumstances in women in particular, because in terms of articulation, we had been occupying several spaces, but due to this pandemic, truly the advances we started going backwards, and the state's responses to the pandemic talks about it looks at the privileged sectors and not the indigenous needs, and it has turned out being ineffective, and it doesn't apply for solving our real needs. We cannot meet the we cannot for example, we cannot do hand washing if we don't have access to water, and the indigenous youth cannot go to their classes if we don't have internet, for example, and electricity. Here in this region, at least here in Paraguay, there are still communities that don't have drinking water, they don't have water, they don't have light, and they have great deficiencies in their household. And there's also the lack of will in politics, corruption, heteronormativity in our society.
Así, la falta de una participación plena y efectiva de los pueblos indígenas e incluirnos dentro de estos procesos de toma de decisiones.
In these decision-making processes more than anything. And more than anything, to continue the conversations for public policies that they may meet our needs from the society, not necessarily that the states decide in our behalf, but that we, but okay, I'm gonna continue. And now to close, currently women live in urban areas where we depend on domestic work, buying, and also other kinds of employment to keep our sustenance. We have had to take risks in having, because of we have been at risk of having COVID because of our jobs, and then the authorities have been violent towards us. For us, indigenous peoples, the pandemic has had us go backwards in regards to the SDGs. And I hope that we continue in the struggle of continuing fighting for this. More than anything, we have a great responsibility to continue mitigating all of these actions so that this is attained. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Gilga. And I believe that you stated that you have a great responsibility as indigenous people through this crisis. Youth can be an important actor to mitigate the impacts of the current crisis. The equality is the issues related to equality are evident now in Paraguay and elsewhere, including the violence which we are witnessing at our homes through this time. Also, accessibility to utilities, as you stated, is also negatively influenced. Without further ado, I would like to have the insights of Miss Elena Marma from Global Policy Watch. What are your insights related to the current crisis and the implementation of Agenda 2030 and SDGs after 5 years from their endorsement? And I would like to ask you, please, to be committed to the 3 minutes intervention. Over to you, Miss Elena.
Sure. Thank you so much, Shaima, and thank you to the Women's Major Group for organizing this wonderful panel and for including me. I'm feeling very grateful. And I first want to just acknowledge and hold a little bit of space for the victims and the families of the victims of a racist and sexist attack that took place this past week in Atlanta, Georgia, in the United States, which is where I am from and based. And a white man opened fire on 3 Asian-owned spas in the area, and 6 Asian women were murdered. And I bring this up because I think it demonstrates clearly the ways in which systems of oppression are interlinking. So the ways in which militarism, racism, patriarchy, fundamentalism, and colonialism exist in an interlinked way, and that, you know, I do believe the 2030 agenda is among our kind of toolkit for addressing and overturning these systems of oppression. And when I think back to when the SDGs were first realized, I remember being eager. I had just finished my studies. I wanted to work to make the SDGs a reality. And after a few years of kind of being in and around the HLPF and the UN, I started to realize that a lot more needed to be done to kind of the way in which the HLPF, the way in which the UN are structured, to be more accountable as a space, to hold member states accountable to commitments, and to really drive forward progress on gender equality among the other SDGs. And so this is where I became really interested in nitty-gritty, kind of often boring, but really important kind of procedural work, reform and review processes. And I think it's important to consider how maybe even the most minute detail is often going to hold quite a lot of political significance. And so it's really important we spend time thinking about the ways in which our structures are constructed in the first place, because they can either limit progress or advance progress. And so right now, we're going through an HLPF high-level political forum review process. And there are some really great opportunities right now to make the space more accountable. I think in light of COVID-19, we've become more aware, or at least COVID-19 has exposed the faults in our global architecture, have exposed the challenges and gaps in implementation, whether it's inequality in terms of access to the COVID-19 vaccine, unsustainable levels of debt, the a disproportionate effect of COVID-19 on women and girls, indigenous populations, the disproportionate climate effects on small island developing states. Many of these issues are coming to the fore. And I think we've, for a very long time, talked about how the SDGs are off track even before COVID-19. And I think now is an opportunity to shift that conversation from just naming that the SDGs are off track to instead asking and asking honestly, why were the SDGs off track? And then answering it with what policy prescriptions can we offer to counter this? And the answers are in kind of shifting from building back better to building back transformatively, reimagining our systems and structures, whether it's monetary and financial frameworks or global trade, intellectual property rights, militarized peacekeeping, militarism, social and cultural norms such as patriarchy, fundamentalism, racism, casteism, and focusing kind of squarely on inequalities in terms of wealth, power, and resources. Because without really looking at the systems and the systemic challenges to achieving the SDGs, we're not going to get there. So that's all I'll say for now. I'm sure we'll have time to cover in more detail.
Thank you so much, Ms. Elena. And I believe that you touched quickly upon very important issues related to the accountability, which you stated that accountability has to be ensured for especially toward the member states in areas related to gender equality, among other SDGs indicators. You also stated that COVID-19 exposed our gaps in the global SDGs implementation architecture. It didn't actually create gaps, but it exposed and showed these gaps. You stated also lastly that looking into the systematic challenges is quite important if we wish really to address the challenges which are associated to the pandemic and the implementation of Agenda 2030 post the pandemic. Now, without further ado, I quickly go to Mrs. Sanila Gorong from Beyond the Beijing Committee and asking her the same question in terms of her insights related to the pandemic impact to the implementation of Agenda 2030 and SDGs through this time. So over to you, Ms. Sanila, and I would like to hear your insights.
Thank you very much, Saima. I would also like to thank the organizer for the invitation. Thank you very much. The pandemic is affecting the world's poorest and most vulnerable people the most. It has exposed harsh and profound inequalities in many societies and is further exacerbating existing disparities within and among countries. The pandemic has impacted across every sphere, from health to the economy, security to social protection, and it deepens economic and social stress, creating new challenges while exacerbating existing challenges for women, girls, and young people. The unprecedented global health, economic, and social crisis from the breakout of COVID-19 has lagged the progress in achieving Agenda 2030. Even before the crisis, the world was off track to fulfilling SDGs goals, and there was uneven progress towards the global goals. The pandemic abruptly disrupted implementation towards many of the SDGs and in some cases turned back years of progress. COVID-19 threatens to reverse the progress of SDG 3, which aims to ensure healthy lives and well-being for all. The world is off track to end poverty by 2030 under SDG 1. And now that we are facing the worst economic recession since the Great Depression, disrupting businesses and in many cases, shutting down small businesses and pushing many people, especially women, to extreme poverty. Goal 4, to achieve inclusive and equitable access to education. Most of the world's children have been deprived of formal education during the COVID-19 outbreak, with possibility of many young girls not returning back and dropping out of school before they complete their education, widening the education gender parity, and could threaten the SDGs' underlying ambition to leave no one behind. Additionally, many countries practice digitalization of education, and many girls lack the access to gadgets and devices, as well as connectivity issue in rural areas, hindering access to education for many girls. Similarly, in regards to Goal 5, countries' progress to gender equality goals, women's well-being has suffered during COVID-19, with incidences of domestic violence increasing in many countries. Many countries were making progress in addressing harmful practices like child marriage, but with the pandemic, many girls and boys are at risk. Women's and young people's choice and decision to exercise their sexual and reproductive health rights has been compromised, resulting in an increase in maternal mortality rate and unable to access information and services, including family planning and safe abortion services. This not only hinders implementation of SDGs, but also to other commitments like ICPD. For many countries, data is a challenge to measure the progress, and with pandemic, disaggregated data is imperative to understand the social and economic impact of the pandemic, and essential to develop short-term programs to reach those in need and start planning for recovery. Lastly, the budget which was focused to address in achieving Agenda 2030, has been shifted to combat COVID-19 without financing SDGs and other agenda-related commitments will not be able to achieve. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Sanela. And I believe that your speech was very comprehensive because you touched upon a lot of issues related to the situation of women and girls right now, including the retreat from some commitments made for some conventions as ICPT, for example, and issues related to the economic impacts due to COVID-19, and also the GBV and domestic violence, especially in developing countries and the countries, of course, of protracted humanitarian contexts as in Arab states. So without further ado, I would like to thank all our panelists, and because we have heard your views on the first 5 years of SDGs and the effect of the current crisis on the implementation from all our panelists, from their countries and from their point of views. Now I would like to ask Ambassador Yuka Salovara, in his current role as a co-facilitator of the Ministerial Declaration negotiations for the High-Level Political Forum 2021. Ambassador, what is your vision for the Ministerial Declaration for the High-Level Political Forum 2021 in terms of the inclusion of gender equality as a cross-cutting issue, considering the effects of the current crisis on the achievement of Agenda 2030? And I would like to kindly remind you that you have 3 minutes, so I wish that you can address this question within this time. Over to you, Your Excellency.
Well, thank you so much, and it is such an important question, and I feel that sort of, well, gender equality is really among the, let's say, foundational SDGs, because, well, if we get sort of gender equality right, then that will open many other doors and sort of facilitate the achievement of the other SDGs. And the same thing is in a way that if we don't make progress on SDGs, then actually progress on the other SDGs will become more difficult. So it is really important that the declaration includes strong language on the impact that the COVID-19 pandemic has had on gender equality worldwide. We have seen a worrying regression on gender equality, for instance, in the employment rate of women and in the division of labor and care responsibilities in households. Most worryingly, rates of violence against women and girls have gone up worldwide. It is therefore important to include language to ensure a gender-responsive recovery from the pandemic and include specific actionable recommendations to address some of the most pressing issues, such as, for instance, closing the digital gender gap. Women and girls have key roles to play as decision makers with regards to the recovery, and this should also be reflected in the declaration. So we are working for the declaration to have very strong language on gender equality. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Excellency, for this insight, because it's a quite important issue. And we appreciate actually the efforts you are making in order to highlight the SDG 5 indicators through this the high-level political agenda, the high-level political forum this year and on its agenda. So by your statement, I would like to move to our next guest. And we now turn to Ambassador Santos. And I would like to ask him, how can we ensure, in your opinion, ambassadors, that the sustainable development processes can be strengthened to deliver on all sustainable development goals, especially sustainable development goal number 5 and its indicators? So over to you, Ambassador Santos.
Thank you so much. Muchísimas gracias. Creo que esta ha sido una cuestión muy discutida.
Thank you so much. I think that this has been a highly discussed matter, and it can be summarized into words. Ability of political representation, which means power for women within our democratic systems, amplifying that power through democratic participation of all women, and with it, decision-making capacity over priorities in the financial distributions, in the budgetary distributions in our government. One of the issues that we have is that when budgets in the governments are discussed, when we apply our budgets in our parliaments, the number of women who are present to make the decisions are very few. And evidently, they are not able, these decisions are not able to represent the many needs of our society. Women's advancement is united to democracy and more representation of women in our democratic mechanisms. And that will allow a second essential element, which is more presence of women in our economies and in the ability of financial decision making in our countries. Because women have entered in the workplace in the more inferior sectors, it has also taken almost 100 years of very slow advancement in the vertical scale of salaries for them to be able to have financial decision-making positions, and they still substantially have a weight on the there's a weight on the economy where their salaries they are not fully integrated in decision-making economies, which is the home care economy. When these issues, as long as these issues do not change, and they need to change from participation democratic processes, it's going to be very difficult to attain for the rest of the 2030 objectives are going to be able to be achieved. Because without women's decision, without representation of the interests of women and girls in these decisions, there's not going to be a 2030 agenda achievement. There's not going to be sustainable economy, and there's not going to be a sustainable environment. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Your Excellency, because it's very important, as you stated, that political and economic participation and engagement of women, because they are very important criteria in order to achieve Agenda 2030. So the economic and political participation is quite important in order to ensure women engagement in the development process globally and in each country. So by this, I would like to move to Dr. Joliet Biao Kaudunkope to ask her the same question, but with addition of the environmental pillars of the Sustainable Development Goals. So how can we ensure, Doctor, in your opinion, that the Sustainable Development processes can be strengthened to deliver all Sustainable Development Goals, especially Sustainable Development Goal 5 and 13, considering the environmental challenges in this process, especially that you stated climate change is quite an important pillar which has to be addressed if we are trying to mitigate the current crisis. So over to you, Dr. Joliet.
Merci beaucoup, Madame Shaina, pour cette question.
Thank you very much, Madame Shaina, for this question.
Me permettez d'aller en français.
I will now switch to French, if that's
Je
okay with you.
commencerai tout d'abord par le niveau politique
First,
et
I
le
will
niveau
start with
stratégique.
the political and
Après
strategic
avoir
level of engagement,
un certain nombre d'éléments du contexte.
after I presented several elements of this context in my previous declaration.
Vous savez, la science est vraiment inéquivoque en ce qui concerne
Science is quite equivocal as regards climate.
Alors que l'Afrique a le moins contribué aux émissions mondiales, seulement
Africa
2
contributed
à 3%,
the least to global emissions, 2 to 3%, barely.
Elle se distingue comme la plus vulnérable au
And
changement
yet,
climatique.
it is the most vulnerable continent to climate change.
Et vous tous, vous conviendrez avec moi
And I think
que
you will all agree with me
les
on the
effets
fact
de la mise en œuvre
the
inefficace
impact of the inefficient
de l'objectif de développement
implementation
durable 5
of SDG number 5
va mettre à mal les solutions dans le domaine du climat.
will question the solutions that have been reviewed for climate change.
Alors, je l'avais dit tantôt, les pauvres sont de manière
I said it already.
disproportionnée vulnérables
Poorest are disproportionately
aux effets du
vulnerable
changement
and
climatique parce
affected
qu'ils
by
n'ont
the
pas de
impact of
ressources
climate change because
nécessaires
they do not have the necessary means and
pour se
resources
remettre rapidement des effets du changement climatique.
to recover rapidly from this climate change.
C'est le cas de l'Afrique où
That applies to Africa.
où le changement climatique s'est vu renforcé encore par
Climate
la
change in
pandémie
Africa
du
has been
COVID-19
further reinforced by the COVID-19 pandemic.
et l'effet de toute réduction des émissions résultant des mesures de confinement n'a été que temporaire. Hein?
And all the reductions in emissions achieved through lockdown measures have only been temporary.
Voilà une région où déjà
This
257
is a region
millions
where already
personnes se
275
couchent
million
ventre vide.
people go to bed with an empty stomach.
Une région où le chômage des jeunes est le
Region
plus
where
élevé, avec un écart
youth
pouvant atteindre
unemployment is
12
the
millions
highest,
d'emplois supplémentaires nécessaires chaque année.
where we know we need to create 12 million new jobs every year if we were to fill that.
Une région qui compte plus de 70% des plus pauvres du monde.
A region that counts with 70% of the poorest individuals in this world.
Et avec la variable du COVID-19, le
Including
contexte
a new
d'adaptation devient
variable
plus
of
désastreux.
COVID-19, this context of adaptation is more and more dire.
La région est confrontée à une croissance négative de
Region is faced with a negative
5,1%
growth
du
of
PIB pour 2020
5.5% of GDP for 2020.
et une perte pouvant atteindre 50% de tous les
Losses
emplois
sometimes reach 50% of all jobs,
et à la première récession en 25 ans.
and that has led us to our first recession in 25 years.
Alors, dans un contexte pareil, je crois que l'adaptation doit
In
être
such
considérée
a
comme une
context, I think
opportunité
that
commerciale
adaptation
et
to be considered
d'investissement.
like a major economic opportunity and a major investment opportunity.
Pas seulement un problème social.
It is not just a social issue.
Cela signifie que la priorité doit être
For
accordée
this to
à la
happen,
résistance
we
au
need
climat
to give a priority to climate
et à la
change,
maximisation de la productivité des
as well
secteurs
as to
fondamentaux
maximizing
qui peuvent créer des
productivity of
opportunités
fundamental
de revenus,
economic sectors, those that can create income opportunities,
d'entreprises, d'emploi et de croissance dans divers secteurs.
entrepreneurship, employment, and growth for a raft of different sectors.
Et ce faisant, nous devons investir dans une analyse
While we do this,
contextuelle
we need
pour
to
comprendre
invest in a
les
contextual
facteurs
analysis
interconnectés
in order
qui
to
façonnent
better
les
understand the
aspirations des
interconnected
hommes et des
factors
femmes
that transcend
afin de
aspirations of
concevoir
both men and
une
women,
action efficace et
so that we
appropriée.
can design an appropriate series of actions.
Il faudra impliquer les hommes pour que les
For this,
structures
we need to
traditionnelles changent.
implicate men to make sure that traditional structures change.
L'atténuation et l'adaptation sont des domaines autonomes et
Mitigation and
complémentaires et
adaptation
non
are
cloisonnés.
standalone and complementary fields of work, not
Le financement
compartmentalized.
de l'adaptation doit aller au-delà
Financing
du social
adaptation means to go
vers le
beyond
financement des
social work. It needs to
investissements.
go towards financing investment.
La question des jeunes, nous devons nous demander
Topic
comment nos
of the
jeunes peuvent
youth is
réaliser
crucial. We need
des
to wonder
opportunités
how
d'entreprises
our youth
rémunératrices tout
can
en dirigeant
be
les efforts
entrepreneurs
d'adaptation de l'Afrique.
while at the same time spearheading the recovery efforts of Africa.
Et la réponse réside dans le réoutillage des compétences de nos jeunes.
For that, we need to better equip our youth.
Et enfin, la cohérence des politiques.
Finally, we need to work on the coherence of our policies.
L'adoption de cette approche intégrée de l'adaptation
Adopting
nécessite
such
des
an
actions
integrated
cohérentes et collaboratives
approach
dans divers secteurs.
needs to be cross-cutting.
Et ces actions doivent être encouragées par des
All
politiques
these actions
sectorielles
must be
cohérentes.
supported by sectorial policies and coherent ones at that.
L'objectif explicite étant de
Explicit
faire en sorte que la
objective is this.
créativité,
We want to
l'énergie,
make
les
sure that
compétences,
creativity,
les talents de
energy,
nos jeunes soient
skills,
délibérément mis à
talents
profit pour
among our
stimuler les
youth
efforts.
are highlighted in order to better stimulate their efforts.
Je vous remercie.
And I thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Joliet, and you touched upon very important issues related to that Africa continent is the least contributing to the global emission, but it is yet the most vulnerable continent to climate change. Climate change has been aggravated by the COVID-19 pandemic, and all the procedures related to lockdown have been already temporary. Hunger is another critical issue in the continent, along with the issue related to unemployment that affects men, but women more severely, of course. Change in tradition traditional patriarchal structure in the continent is important to ensure equality and political transformations. To have gender equality as a cross-cutting issue is important to ensure political coherence in this regard. Without further ado, I would like to hear from our members on the ground, indigenous, activist, Western Guarani people, Ms. Gelga Guiner from Paraguay. I would like to ask you, what has been your experience as an indigenous woman in engaging in decision-making spaces at the local, national, regional, and global levels? And what are some specific challenges in full and effective participation of indigenous women in decision-making processes? How has COVID-19 pandemic impacted it? So now let's hear from Ms. Guinar, and I would like to remind you that you have maximum 3 minutes for your contribution. Over to you, Ms. Guinar.
Sí, ¿qué tal? Vuelvo a acotar, mi nombre es Helga.
Yes, my name is Helga, so that is better pronounced, Helga. Okay, how is my experience as an indigenous woman, as an activist youth? Decision making, I think that hand in hand with the states, be it the municipal government, taking into account our needs and working from sustainability. From my experience, it has created very positive results at a local level. Nationally, joined with youth networks, we also implement the same situation, but it doesn't have the same effect because of the frequent political, unfortunately, barriers, be it corruption or persecution. Unfortunately, we also talk about gender violence, and this whole experience has created going backwards in the full participation of decision making. And at a global level, one of the compañeras, Elena, we have created networks who have created a positioning in a very considerate way. Women in networks have always been strong, but during this pandemic, we are overwhelmed with responsibilities because we have to do a family caretaking, territory caretaking, culture caretaking, family caretaking. We have had great difficulties as well. In the states, for our people, we have resource to making our own decisions for the benefit of all of our peoples under the legal framework of all of our rights, which gives us free will. We have closed frontiers in our area, in our territory. We have also mobilized our surveillance systems. And in the local way, we can handle it perfectly well. But at a national level, very often there is many fallbacks. And I think that violence is a topic that goes hand in hand with the decision-making topic, one for being women and for being an indigenous woman. And also we talk about generalized violence and harassment in public life. I don't know if I made myself understood or if I could speak more to this. Unfortunately, very often we are left silenced, and there have been women who have been murdered, unfortunately, for defending these rights and the free will or being able to decide for our own communities. That is what they have died for. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Helga, and sorry for the mispronunciation because it was written by G, but thank you so much for correcting me. As you stated, corruption and oppression of activists is quite often in our communities, especially on local level. Activists networking, as you stated, is very important in order to create effective and powerful positions through this crisis. Creating partnerships is important also, and it's a quite effective method to address the current challenges. You stated that women rights defenders are usually silenced or even murdered at the end of your discussion, and I believe that we are all understand the challenges are faced by the women in Paraguay and the developing or global South in general. So thank you so much for the intervention. And without further ado, I would like to hear from Ms. Sanela Gorong. As a young woman from the global South, Ms. Sanela, what gender-specific challenges are you facing that are hindering the achievement of Sustainable Development Goals implementation and other gender-related commitments? Of course, you are working at the Beijing Platform for Action, so I think that you have a lot to say in this regard. So over to you, Ms. Sanela.
Thank you. We have celebrated Beijing Plus 25, ICPD 25 during Nairobi Summit, and we are 5 years into implementing Agenda 2030. And with ongoing pandemic, all these commitments have been impacted. The ongoing commitment has intensified the issues related to gender. The impact of COVID-19 is yet to unfold. The immediate impact of COVID-19 can be seen in education, health, especially SRHR, employment, unpaid care work, and domestic violence, and gender-based violence, hindering the achievement of SDGs and other commitments. In regards to sexual and reproductive health rights, and especially focusing on ICPD commitments, during the restrictive measures in many countries, we saw a surge in domestic violence. Many women and girls were forced to live in close proximity with their abusers without any access to services and support system. Many women and young people were unable to access contraceptive, family planning methods and services, such as safe abortion. During lockdown, maternity mortality increased due to birth complication as many women were unable to access services in time. Right to bodily autonomy, choice, and decision on the sexual and reproductive health rights and access to comprehensive information and services, including safe abortion services, needs to be addressed during recovery plan, ensuring their right to SRHR will assist them to reach their full potential, address their well-being, and contribute to an individual in recovery process to build back better. Likewise, many women, girls, and boys, especially from marginalized groups, are at risk of child marriage, as the harmful practices such as dowry continues to exist, and the pandemic has intensified these practices. In order to uphold international commitments and achieve gender equality, the government and international community needs to redesign, articulate global agendas and address the specific need of young women and girls and address their SRHR. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Sanela. And as you stated, that the existing global forums have been impacted severely by the COVID-19 in terms of the women participation. You stated that GBV is hindering the achievement of Sustainable Development Goals as well as the other country commitments. Now, I would like to move to Ambassador Salovara, and I would like to ask you, taking into consideration the realities we have heard from the ground as well, I would like to ask you, how can we ensure, in your opinion, that the sustainable development processes can be strengthened to deliver on all sustainable development goals, especially the SDG number 5 with its indicators? So over to you, Ambassador, for your kind intervention.
Thank you so much, Shaima, and let me start by saying that, well, it was so interesting to hear all the interventions and views from sort of, well, from the other panelists who are really working on the ground around these important issues. But when it comes to strengthening the delivery of SDGs and especially SDG 5, I think that we need to take a whole of society approach to implementing the SDGs. And that's about including all stakeholders. Sustainable development should really be incorporated into all phases of the policy cycle: planning, budgeting, reporting, challenges remain in ensuring that all the phases of the policy cycle are interconnected in a systemic way. Policy planning should guide the preparation of the budget, and reporting should clearly indicate how the government has succeeded in the allocation of resources into policy areas that promote sustainable development in a desired manner. This comprehensive approach ensures policy coherence because, well, and that's perhaps a beauty of the SDGs in a way that, well, we really need to get all the elements in place, and for that to work in a way that we need to take a comprehensive and holistic approach in really ensuring that sort of all the different aspects of the SDGs sort of reinforce each other. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. And I would like now, because you touched upon very important issue related to financing, which is quite important to ensure the implementation of sustainable development goals and creation of the synergies, and also having the SDG 5 as a cross-cutting issue. So thank you so much for this insight. I would like to move to Ms. Elena and to ask her about how can we ensure that the high-level political forum is truly an accountability mechanism from your point of view, and what needs to be reformed in the current process to ensure that the high-level political forum is an effective modality, especially in regards to accelerating the commitments and the progress towards Goal 5 and the other SDGs. Over to you, Ms. Elena.
Thank you so much, Shaima. So I have had the wonderful opportunity to work with many members of the Women's Major Group. We recently issued a position paper on the HLPF review process. And so it is available on the Women's Major Group site for you to review at your leisure, but I'll touch on kind of a few of our most salient points that are key to unlocking progress on gender equality. And some have been kind of mentioned in some ways by other panelists. The first that I've talked a bit about is the focus on systemic barriers and challenges to implementation, framed with a focus on inequalities. So some of those that we've mentioned, and we mentioned in more detail in the paper, are related to macroeconomic policy, unequal distribution of the COVID-19 vaccine, militarism, patriarchy, fundamentalism, racism, colonialism. We also discuss the intersections of environmental issues around decarbonization, global supply chains, and another that relates across many categories is also related to corporate accountability, holding corporations and actors outside of just the member states within the UN system, but also the IMF, the World Bank, the World Trade Organization, bringing those into the sphere of accountability as well. And so a second is, and kind of a key point that we make is that the SDGs, because they are so interlinked, cannot be reviewed in a goal by goal basis. So the way that we have the HLPF right now is that every year a few goals are selected, and our proposal actually is to have all SDGs reviewed each year. Because they are so interlinked, interconnected, we cannot review SDG 5 on gender equality without reviewing, like so many other panelists have mentioned, health, water and sanitation, education. These goals are so interrelated. It's impossible to just kind of pick a few every year, and it also, having a holistic review every year of all SDGs prevents member states from kind of picking and choosing what year they present their VNR, because the SDGs selected that year might make them look better, for example. And that leads to my next point, which is just enhanced civil society participation at the HLPF. We want to see and need to see greater participation of civil society. And I think within this past year of virtual meeting modalities, we have become very aware of the kind of challenges to participation of civil society, whether it is access to resources and visas for civil society organizations around the world to come to UN headquarters, or in a virtual meeting world like we're experiencing now, it is the digital divide and access to technology, access to the means to hop on a meeting on Zoom, or even that the time zones are not great across the board, and people are meeting until the middle hours of the evening for them. We've seen some great good practices from, I'm pleased to see Ambassador Yuko with us today, because we recently were discussing the HLPF review together earlier in the week, and Finland has set some good practices around including civil society in delegations to the HLPF, and it would be wonderful to see that not only normalized but formalized in some way, whether it is in the HLPF review or agreements among member states to make this a common practice. Another point that I want to make is around policy coherence with the human rights system and the human rights architecture. The human rights architecture makes up, I think, only 3.7% of the overall UN budget, yet it is such a central system, especially to making the SDGs a rights-based agenda, framing them as rights-based, framing them as an agenda to be accountable to. So that's including not only including civil society in the HLPF as inputs to the HLPF, but also including the human rights system. So special procedures, independent experts and mandate holders for the human rights system, including their inputs, including those in participation at the VNRs, to make the VNRs a space where we can have honest and open dialogue and conversation, rather than just a kind of presentation of from a member state of their kind of best, headlines, I guess you could say. And so in the paper, we talk a lot about how to reshape the VNR process with kind of some small tweaks to lengthening the VNR process by a day, changing the length of each VNR section, including civil society and human rights and UN specialized agencies in the VNR discussion as well. And the last point is to think and to establish the HLPF or to establish the 2030 agenda as more than just the 2 weeks every July that we have the HLPF, to really think about how we can set up our structures and our different policy processes to not only be coherent with both the SDGs and human rights architecture, but also to think about how we can better link to the regional fora on sustainable development, national processes on sustainable development, to really ensure that we're thinking about and building into our national policies, regional policies, etc., the SDGs year round. And so I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Ms. Elena, and it's very important issues that you raised in terms of review of the current mechanisms, which is quite important, greater participation of civil society organizations, and you stated that unluckily we are witnessing inclusion of governments, as today, for example, in our events, and I thank ambassadors again for joining us, and there's a belief in the importance of inclusion of civil society through these processes. You stated that human rights architecture has to enjoy more financial consideration of the UN financial structure. And finally, open and frank dialogue with concrete interventions is better than just the presentations, especially by governments. So I thank you, and because we are running out of time, I would like to just move quickly to Dr. Biao, Dr. Joliet Biao. I would like to ask you, given the direct interlinkages between climate change, gender and women's resilience, what are your recommendations from the United Nations Environment Programme perspective for effective and accelerated response to the impact of climate change, especially on women and girls in the context of the Sustainable Development Goals. So over to you, Dr. Biao, for your intervention.
Thank you so much, Ms. Shaima. I think I'll be very, very brief because much has been already said by the previous speakers. You know, what I used to say when I attend this kind of event from year to year is that we kind of repeat sometimes the same thing from year to year. I think the first thing that we need to do is to assess really a real assessment of what did not work, what has not worked well. That will be the starting point. And really to stop doing business as usual. We know that the COVID-19 really offered a great opportunity, although there were many challenges, great opportunity for innovations. And the stimulus package that the government are drawing up to recover from COVID-19 is also another opportunity. So the United Nations Environment Program will really look into the issues of data. Data in terms of availability, but also data literacy. Because if we really want to think globally, to think regionally, but to act locally, we need to break down those data that will touch the minds and the hearts of people on the ground to act together on climate change. And that's also include the women, the men, because no one should not be left behind. So data is critical. And on data, we need synergy action within the UN system. You know, taking advantage of the reforms of the UN development system. We need to speak the same language, coming together so that we don't confuse the government, supporting them to generate and to analyze data, but also capacity to use those data and also to monitor the data. We heard from previous panelists that, you know, even protection measures, what are the new protocols to collect data? If we are challenged by COVID-19, those aspects really have to be looked into. We talked about indigenous knowledge. You know, UNEP role is to bring the science to inform policies. We used to work on the global environment outlook, sometimes 700 pages. When we want people to act on the ground, we need to start thinking about breaking down those data. And we have started already with our young people, because last year during the African Ministerial Conference on the Environment, the young people have published the global environmental outlook in their language and for the youth. I think this effort has to continue, and this is where we are working. We are working, retooling the young people, retooling the skills of the young people is very essential. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Joliet. And I believe that your comments and points are very important, because you stated firstly about the assessment now is important at this stage to know what didn't work well and identify defaults. So we stop business as usual and create new modalities for engagement. You also stated that taking advantage of the current UN reform system that's happening now to monitor and generate more data in order to identify new protocols for engagement and to provide more data, which is quite important in order to identify the defaults and gaps. Finally, you stated that you mentioned the Global Environmental Forum, which is led by youth, last year. And so letting youth to lead is very important at this point in order to tapping into, for example, the demographic dividend, especially in our continent in Africa. So I thank you so much for this intervention. And I would like to go to now to Ambassador Santos and ask him, women's defenders and feminist entities and collectives since the origination of the pandemic, they are fully committed to responding to the needs of civil society, where the state doesn't reach. Furthermore, globally, they have few resources. And the context of COVID-19, the virtual participation has increased even the challenges for more meaningful participation in the global spaces and decision-making forums. In this context, I would like to ask you, Ambassador Santos, how can the meaningful participation of feminists and women defenders be guaranteed in such context at the high-level political forum? So over to you, Your Excellency.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Muchísimas gracias. Todos los avances.
Thank you very much. All of the advances that have taken place in women's rights and girls' rights have had a precedent in an important increase of organization in our own countries, an autonomous organization of women themselves. And this has enabled their participation in other democratic processes. This happened in the 20s and the 30s, where in Europe there was a huge feminist movement of women based in the neighborhoods and the health of neighborhoods and capacity and ability of consumption of families. And the same thing happened after World War II. There was also a sudden increase in the ability of organization of women and the right for women to vote in a battle that started at the ends of the 19th century and that wasn't completely reached until ends of the 20th century. An important part of the budgets to supporting autonomous organization of women for their capacity of decision making and this decision in the public processes. It is an essential element. It is the biggest element, because if this is not done, if they don't have a capacity of autonomous pressure, we cannot advance more equitably and with more efficacy in budgets. For example, during the pandemic, we will not be able to advance in a financial autonomy that allows them time to be able to participate in decision-making processes. All of this is joined to a main process, which is the autonomous organization power of women. And that's why talking about participation of civil society in all of the processes, not just locally, but also in state, national, and global level. In the United Nations and other international organizations, we need to reserve a specific space and try to increase it, be it maybe gradually, towards parity. Parity is an essential part. How do we say in relationship to climate change that in 2050 we need neutrality in emissions to be able to save the planet? We need to talk about gender equality. The sooner the better, to be able to ensure the reach of our goals. And in this sense, my last message is that we need to support, collaborate, help in women's autonomous collaboration and participation of civil society in all of the processes of decision, multilateral decision-making processes, not just national, but international. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Santos, for this insight and intervention. And without further ado, I have a few questions from our attendants because we are actually running out of time thanks to your great insights and point of views. The first question is for Ambassador Salovara, and it is from our member, Cynthia, Chair of Non-Governmental Organization Commission on Aging in New York, and she would like to ask, how can we ensure the older women voices are heard through the HLPF and the other regional and global forums from your point of view? So over to you, Your Excellency, Ambassador Salovara.
Thank you so much, and thank you for the good question. And of course, listening to older people is part of the process, and I believe that the best way to make that voice heard is really to work through sort of through civil society organizations. And for example, when we had a discussion on the HLPF ministerial declaration, then with the women's major group, and other stakeholders, in a way that there was also a representative sort of from sort of an organization representing sort of elder citizens. So I think that sort of it's really sort of the NGO and the CSO engagement is key in this. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Your Excellency, because it's very important, of course, to have them from the onset of any processes. That's why, as you stated, that to have their voices heard later on, it's quite important to include them from the onset of any processes. So this is very important to state now. So without any delay, I would like also to have a question maybe to Dr. Joliet, because we got a question from Red Pepper Turkey. It's one of our members, and stated that data, because Dr. Joliet, you stated or you mentioned the data. However, the data coming from governments sometimes is not reliable, and it's not actually reflecting the current situation in any country. So from your point of view, and given the lack of resources of civil society organizations, how we can ensure that the data provided by our governments are actually reflecting the reality and ensuring the inclusion of civil society organization insights and point of views in terms of the data, and especially segregated data by gender, for example. So I would like to ask you, because you mentioned this, how we can ensure reliability of the data provided in any of our global forums. So over to you, Dr. Joliet.
Thank you very much, Ms. Shaima. I think the fact that the data that are coming from the government are not reliable really justify, the relevance of the UN system to support them on the data. The way we do it is that, we have the template, we provide the templates, and also we use the common country analysis that are very critical in the process of the UN reforms, really to support the countries. Normally, if the data were reliable, in terms of account ownership, it will be good really to let the countries really collect the data. But you mentioned also the voluntary review, Vienna, the voluntary national review. Those are the processes where we support really the UN resident coordinators to also collect the data from countries. At a more higher level, we have for Africa, we have the ECA, Economic Commission for Africa, which also supports a lot on the data. So, we need also to be careful as a UN system. We don't own the data. If we want the government to own the data, we need to support them in collecting, in analyzing, but building also their capacity. So yes, I agree with, I have to agree with you. And you see the COVID-19, even in the health system, really demonstrates that our fragility in terms of health system. It's also demonstrate the lack of the data in the health system. So this is where we are really working. And again, there is a challenge if, as a UN system, we do not come together to triangulate those data, and everyone is going into different direction. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Joliet, for your insights, because you touched upon very important mechanisms, the voluntary national reviews, which also the civil society organizations can provide actually shadow reports, the Commission of Status of Women and the CSW reports, which also the civil society organizations can provide shadow reports for this, including the data mentioned in these reports. The CCA is also a very important, I believe, mechanism to collect reliable data and providing the gaps that civil society organizations, along with the United Nations agencies, can work to address. Also, you stated that the Africa Economic Commission is very important because you are always supporting the data generation process with the government, and definitely the United Nations does not. The United Nations organizations don't own the data, so definitely civil society organizations' engagement is always valuable in order to have concrete data, gender segregated data. So I thank you so much for your intervention and response. And because we came, actually we ran out of time, thanks to your valuable point of views, we came to the end of our parallel event. On behalf of the participating members of the Women Major Group and our secretariat and our organizing partners, I thank the esteemed panelists because actually they took a lot from your point of views and your insights and valuable ideas. The event came to its end, but not our open dialogue as feminists. I conclude by the glorious statement of Maya Angelou, who said, "Each time a woman stands up for herself without knowing it possibly, without claiming it even, she stands up for all women." So I thank you so much for this very important parallel event, and I appreciate your attendance, and I wish to see you in upcoming parallel events soon. So thank you so much.